Well, I'm going to try to continue. Not easy. And what happened was this puppy who's still making noise, settle down, is causing me to have some discontinuity in our presentation. Those most common streptococcus pneumonia, very significant in the hospital, Klebsiella pneumonia, very significant for the rest of us, mycoplasma pneumonia, and maybe a little chlamydophilia, which don't mistake that. It's a chlamydia-based organism, but it doesn't mean that somebody had a sexually transmitted disease. Okay, it's respiratory. We do see it's not a severe presentation. I mean, exactly how it was transmitted, I will have to review. But walking pneumonias are notoriously annoying in the sense that they're not severe. The fever is not as high. Typically, with a bacterial pneumonia, like strep or the other pneumonia, Klebsiella, you're looking at 102 to 104 fevers. You're looking at chest pain, difficulty breathing, coughing up blood or blood tinged drainage. Uh, uh, Typically, a spike of fever, as we look like in the hospital. A lot of pain, chest oriented pain, not necessarily cardiac pain, but chest related pain. All of these are things that are about pneumonia. So it's something you just have to lay back and rest and not do a whole lot with. Right? That's just the way it works. So what we do see with walking pneumonia, and that's what it was characterized because we saw it in military recruits, it's in dormitories, it's in barracks, and but they could still walk. In other words, they could still drill and train even though they had a cough and things like so. The fever to some extent was either absent or low grade, and it was more fatigue inducing, but it lingered. It took, typically a couple of weeks. So, and interestingly, for both of those, the drug of choice would probably be the Z-Pak or a tetracycline derivative, something like that. We will look later at uh, histoplasma capsulatum and coccidioides mycosis, which are these fungus. They, they are relatively uncommon, except if you're in an area where they're predisposed. And I'll give you a couple examples from the other textbook that are part of it. They are a little more common than you think. We do see them in immunosuppressed people. And interestingly, that was the pneumococcal and fungal was called pneum, I beg your pardon, pneumocystic pneumonia, which in the old days was called PCP pneumonia, was the actual defining pneumonia of AIDS. So fungal pneumonia, unless you're in an area that's very predisposed to it, and there's a couple that we'll get to. The reality is that it typically means your immune system is in big trouble for whatever reason. If you have HIV, it's called an AIDS-defining diagnosis, and that's scary. And hantavirus, again, we'll talk about as severe pneumonia that's associated with rodent droppings. Again, unless you're somewhere where you're in close proximity to them, that could do with socioeconomic status. For the most part, that has to do with areas of the country that were there. And we talked about that a little bit in viruses because it's associated with rodent droppings, dry, arid areas like that are part of it. And again, secondary to influenza. So those are all interesting aspects of this that you can see. This is their little nugget, and I want to go through it. When this went to bed, okay, in other words, when they published this, it was probably, as you can see here, COVID information in this chapter is current as of July 2020. We're nearly 3 years away. They didn't have the immunization. They did not have the knowledge of exactly what it is. They weren't aware of all the different mutations that transpired as part of this whole everything COVID wise that we suffered so much through and really was life altering. All that types of stuff was it was so you could most of you know where it came. It was originated. We either came from a laboratory accident or from a laboratory potentially, or from that market and move. I don't know, and I'm not going to get into it because people have made too much of an effort to politicize it. And if it's actually the SARS-CoV-2 is the appropriate name, the reality is that we all call it COVID-19 or just COVID. And some people totally asymptomatic, and some people die relatively quickly. And it's very difficult to predict unless someone has a ton of comorbidities, because we saw that so many different cases where people who we thought were very healthy succumbed relatively young and surprisingly, and others who were, uh, relatively speaking, ill didn't. Where people who were considerably older and maybe had some underlying medical conditions got sick but didn't succumb to it. So, it, as you can see, it's mostly immunological. It mostly triggers a lot of inflammatory changes, typically associated with various what we call pro-inflammatory agents that come out. These are agents that induce an increased amount of inflammation to the point where it's not beneficial but harmful. So, anytime blood vessels leak, it can cause damage in a variety of organs that are there. Okay, it says people have been hospitalized as well as those with milder symptoms that reflect the systemic nature for weeks to months, and everybody has a different story. Okay, I had it. I would tell you, I have it over the summer. I'm trying to recall. It wasn't at this. I had it at the start of last summer. I thought that was, but I didn't have the test handy at home. But I felt like it, and basically it was probably. I think I missed a week of summer teaching, where I was just teaching once a week, and maybe a week that I really wasn't functional. The next week I came and I coughed a lot, but I was able to deal with it, and after that it was gone. And my wife was in bed with just weak as a kitten for about 10 days. No respiratory symptoms. She tested positive on both occasions that we did the home test, and she couldn't lift her head up off the pillow, to the point where, I mean, her brother was in town for 2.5 weeks, who lives in Arizona, who she sees once or twice a year. Didn't see him other than one day at the very end. Go figure. That kind of stuff. Because we didn't want to take a chance. They were staying with her 96-year-old mom, he and his wife. So all of that, okay. So as you can see, this multi-inflammatory, and all of this probably has changed. And I don't feel the need at this point. Here's my 2 cents about it. It's like any of these viruses that are novel viruses, just like some of the flu viruses that emerge. And then the reality is they begin to mutate. Most of these mutations are something that they're going to comment on called antigenic drift, subtle changes in the spikes. And it's my understanding that COVID has the H or the hemagglutinin spike, just like influenza. And that alters the efficacy, the ability of these immunizations to truly be effective. They'll tell you, "Oh my God, that just get 3 more shots; it'll take care of this variant." The reality is, it's modifying. It's becoming part of us. I think, just like influenza, and we're starting to morph into something. Occasionally, it'll be a problematic. Maybe it'll be a little bit quicker to get. Maybe it'll be more contagious, but it's typically not been as severe as there. Uh, does it mean that we stop using precautions and things like that? No. I think the good thing about all of this is now we're much more aware of hand care. We're more aware of when somebody is potentially, uh, uh, if they think they're ill, they're more likely to stay away from groups, not come to school, not go to work. We're able to work remotely or teach remotely, things like that. I had an extraordinarily difficult time for the roughly 2 years we had to wear a mask every day to work. I think it's just more of a problem in older people, but not all of us have that. Some of my older colleagues, not troubled by it at all. We have plenty of students who wear masks. That's their prerogative. It's not mandatory one way or the other. I do not know if you have teachers who want you to wear a mask. They are, at least contractually and based on the university policy, they're able to do that. Not me. I want to see your bright smiling faces when you show up. So the RNA spikes, which allow it to attach, those are like the H spike. We see them. That's where it gets its name, from the crown. Yes, it's initially crossing to humans. Okay, uh, systemic effects. These bradykinins. Basically it attached to receptors that normally would have triggered anti-inflammatory effects, triggered things that would cause your respiratory passageways to stay open, as opposed now it's making them get closed. So it had almost a reverse effect. It should have triggered agents that were able to allow you to adapt. It doesn't appear. It appears that it blocks interferon, which keeps it from doing other cells, and that's what they knew back then. So there's a whole lot to it, and I think we're learning more about it. But right now, I think we're learning that it's a problem that we're going to have. It's just a new virus. We now have the big three: RSV, influenza, and COVID, and they're going to be with us for a long time. Period. Okay, droplets in air, other routes we're not so sure about when they wrote this, and I think it's just ludicrous. If if you're oh my goodness, I'm trying to think of a right way to express it without being overly controversial. People were, oh my God, touch something, don't go there. Oh and my sister's older than I am, and her husband's older still. They're going to be seven. He's 80, she's 78. When this broke out 3 years ago, their ages. She goes, I would never go to a public restroom. Well, I mean, yeah, somebody could be coughing or sneezing or stuff like that. I mean, if you got to go, you got to go. I mean, if you're uncomfortable, wear a mask, take precautions, whatever you have to do. I mean, there's a point where I think you have to live your life as long as you're not exposing to somebody who's ill or anything like that. I think you still have to conduct things, and it impacted so many people. Okay, it, asymptomatic carriers, people circulating, potentially reservoirs and carriers. These are all these things that are part of it. You don't know. I mean, if you're on, do do as much hand care as you possibly can without irritating your skin. Be careful. Don't, if somebody's ill, kind of stay away from them. If you're ill, don't come in. That's about what I would say. Uh, so at this point, yes, the vaccine development was something called an mRNA vaccine. And effectively, mRNA makes protein. So they were basically generating a vaccine that was going to insert specific messenger RNA to make this. The technology had been around for a long time. There's so much debate about it. I don't think we know the full impact of these. They were not without consequences. Some people got very ill with them, depending on, and again, the politicizing of it. So some people will only cite the bad. There are websites where every time somebody dies who's under 60, they talk about it. They find out if they're vaccinated or not. And they think, oh my God, it's because of that. I don't know. So is the best thing physical distancing? I might buy that to some extent. Yes, I don't know if I buy that completely. I think you just have to be with a moderate degree of caution. I don't mean to be preachy about it. My 2 cents is don't believe everything you read or hear or see. There's entirely too much agenda driven material in today in the 24-hour news cycle. And that bothers me. That does bother me. Okay. I just want to know just give me the facts and let me react to them appropriately. So the distance between a community and hospital acquired, okay, typically community what most people would get seasonally, elderly folks, underlying diseases, all of those types of things. I believe I got this pneumonia shot sometime when I was over age 60. Uh, it has to be about 10 years ago. Someone will probably try to give me another one. And frankly, the last time I had my doctor who is retired, and I have another doctor, said, I think you should get another one. I said, I think I'll pass. Okay. I'm getting a little shaky about that. I don't feel that I'm unhealthy, and since I don't smoke anymore. Another one, Legionnaires is comparatively rare. It only happened because of when we identified it. It was an older water. It's a common bacteria. We didn't know about it. They thought it was a recurrence of the dreaded Spanish flu because it was named for the Legionnaires. And I think I told you the story at the old Bellevue Stratford in Philadelphia. At the bicentennial, you had vets from World War I and World War II, and mostly older people who all drank and smoked and told tall tales. And they were in an older building that was grandfathered in, just like our Ben Franklin Hotel. Beautiful hotel, built in probably right after the Civil War. And all, when I say grandfathered in, all the coding for passageways, the crawl spaces for ventilation and water and electricity were all the same thing. And so they got dusty, and if the pipes leaked a little bit, now you had a combination of a dusty environment with moisture, and it was a breeding ground, like a giant culture plate for for a bacteria that existed but grew under specific circumstances. Voila! It turned out to be Legionella pneumophila, a small gram-negative rod. So it can persist. We see it mostly where in water, cooling towers on top of buildings, spas, so hot tubs, particularly enclosed hot tubs, which you have to worry about when they're inside a building in a health club. If you have, we have one on our deck that we dropped into our deck. Ours is dropped in. A lot of people have it on, reinforce their deck and put it on top because water is heavy. All sorts of things, resistant to chlorine, you know, aerosol formation carried for long distances. That's why ventilation is so important. So I bring that to you. We've had a couple of outbreaks of significance, and unfortunately, the most significant one was in the Vets Hospital here in Pittsburgh, where a number of people died who are veterans. And I'm not going to get into the VA and what I feel has been some real concerns with veterans who are older, and oftentimes that's where they have to seek treatment, particularly if they have a lot of financial problems that are there, or they don't have insurance, they don't have good insurance. Okay, their go-to has always been the VA. I mean, I've worked and trained in VA hospitals over time, and there's good and bad. This is less about the hospital, more about the facilities, less about the doctors and more about the facilities. And they really needed to upgrade their water and water treatment systems, is my understanding, and that's as far as I'm going to go with it. It's not that difficult to treat. The trouble is the people who got this when it was originally discovered in '76 were already had a lot of comorbidities. They all drank, they smoked, they were older, and about, in a small group, say a few hundred people were at this convention, and about 15 people died, and it had these very visible, nasty flu-like symptoms. Classic influenza, and we're going to get to that as well. So atypical pneumonia, not the same. Droplets, but students, family, military, walking, not really acute. Fairly easy to take care of. The hantavirus, this was when they talk about the Four Corners area, they're talking about the desert southwest. So you're looking at Arizona, Mexico, Utah, and Colorado. That area, I believe geographically, it's dry. There's a lot of rodents. There's a lot of dust. There's a lot of swirling winds, and it can carry with. It's typically rodent droppings, urine, feces, saliva. Yosemite, it's California. So I mean, and this is a very severe disease. This can be a killer disease. And so it has to do with it. So really, it's like that. So again, rodent-borne diseases, rodent control is the answer. Histoplasmosis, this is a fungus. It's everywhere. It's associated here. Where we see this, they used to call it spelunker's disease. So for people who like to go caving, particularly in wet caves, bats played a role into it with bird and bat droppings and bat urine are bad juju. They are not good to have. Okay, moist soils, high nitrogen, fungal extract in the skin and monitoring. So basically, when we're monitoring for deep fungal infections, there's a whole series of tests that are delayed reaction hypersensitivity. And it's part of the workup years ago, as well as for TB, of what was called FUO, fever of unknown origin, or our British friends, PUO for pyrexia, their word for fever of unknown origin. And you got a whole series of little TB tests, like shots that they'd map out and put a marker, an indelible mark on your skin, go to Sharpie and say, okay, this is histo, this is coccidio, this is whatever. Okay, all these different ones that are there. And you have to treat them specifically once they're identified with an antifungal. This is the other one that's so famous now. We call it pneumocystic carinii, and that was the original name. Now it's Giravisi, been around for a while. This was the opportunistic infection that the doctor in San Francisco identified in gay men who had immunosuppression based on their helper T cell counts, and all of a sudden figured out that their immune systems were collapsing and wrote the paper back in 1981 that diagnosed AIDS. It was around before that. I've told you that story. Inhalation of spores, antifungal drugs are ineffective, okay, comparatively speaking. So it's not a good thing to have. And so let's stop it there. And I want to make sure I get as many of these other bacteria covered. We didn't do TB yet. We will. We're going to look at respiratory viruses, healthcare associated pneumonias, different strains like that. They'll talk about the clubs again. A lot about influenza. This is where we talk about this very, very interesting external envelope with all those alternating H and N spikes that we'll talk about. These and these genetics that are able to literally shift and change places. Very, very fascinating. We'll talk about drift and shift that are there, various other factors and epidemiology, etc., 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 and some of the treatments. Then we'll get back, as you can see, to whooping cough and RSV, and I think we'll probably end with TB as I'm looking through this. There's a lot on TB. So we'll cover all this. The only thing I don't see is the diphtheria nugget. Look what they say. Vaccine is very community with a relatively low case fatality rate. I don't know if that's so true. The initial studies were that people were conscious. That was the whole drive for that immunization. They said, well, it's very communicable. It has a high percentage fatality rate. I again, understand that there's lies, damn lies in statistics. Anybody who tested COVID positive and died was alleged to have died because of COVID. A 100-year-old person who died was a very famous sports writer who died, who was COVID positive when he entered the hospital. He's 100 years old. Give me a break. You know, are you sure I was perfectly healthy before that? I don't know. So there's a lot of, which I'll be kind, shenanigans going on. And most of us are aware of that. And so they give you a laundry list, and I'll come back and pick up where we left off. I feel like talking more because my voice is starting to go. And try to finish this chapter. I finished up with that Pneumocystis cerevisiae. I'll put these on there, and thanks a lot. Maybe I'll have these done through the weekend. I do want to get through this stuff for you. All right. Thanks again. Bye-bye.